been asked to do an audit or tax tender, or at least change your auditors or tax providers and don't know the best way to do that? Well, today I'm going to take you through when is the right time to consider an upgrade, and then what do you do to find a new provider. Hi, my name is Alysha Randall, and I am the founder of Fast Growth Consulting and Financial Leadership Foundations. And we do fractional CFO work and then also train new and aspiring CFOs that work for startups and scale-ups. And today I just wanted to touch on upgrading your service providers, but we'll focus on audit and tax. So I very distinctly remember the first time I had to do this. I was quite a new leader and probably not surprised to hear that I did internally freak out. And I was asked to do this just because I had never done it before. And if that's you, then go through this and you'll know how to do it. I always find it amusing because the process is and after you've done it a few times, you aren't fazed by it at all. But obviously the first time you do it, it can be a little bit daunting. So I personally work with founders who are pre-seed Series A up to about Series B. And because of that, I often see new shareholder agreements come through. And fortunately, I would say most Series A shareholder agreements don't have an audit requirement. I have seen a few Series A come through with an audit requirement. Often we're able to delay the audit for a year or two, but it does, I'd say most Series B, by Series B, you'll most definitely have to do an audit. So whether it is starting an audit from the very first time, or when you start working for a startup and they still have their tax accountants from when the company very first started, and potentially the tax is getting a little bit more complicated and therefore you need to upgrade. Essentially, you don't want a really teeny tiny tax company, but at the later stages, particularly if you're looking international or you are really fast growing and there are some tax compliance or what's more likely tax planning tasks that need to be done, and your local, say, Wimbledon tax department on the high street probably doesn't work for you anymore. So sufficient to say I've prepared a lot of tax or audit tenders, and generally this kind of process is what I do. But also I would say it's the same when you're upgrading suppliers. So procure to pay, the P2P process often sits with the finance lead in a startup or scale up. So looking at key suppliers, key supplier risk is something that you should be doing quite regularly. So how do you get started? So essentially the first step is to work out what is required. So for audit, it's thinking about what companies need to be audited. Is it just the one parent entity or one small company as part of the group, or the entire group? So the instance where it may not be the entire group is if the audit needs to happen because of, say, FCA regulation. So you may have one company that's regulated and that needs to be audited, and the rest of the group doesn't need to be audited yet because the shareholder agreement doesn't require it, and also the size of the company is too small and also doesn't require it. So there is instances where you don't need to look at the entire group. You also need to consider the deadline. So when does the audit need to be completed? So sometimes within, again, the shareholder agreement, there may be stipulations that the audit has to be completed within 90 days, 120 days of year end. So ideally, you should be having conversations with audit firms 9 months before the deadline. And the reason for this is that they really need to plan when the audit needs to happen, and then need to make sure they have enough resources. And audits take a long time. Over the last few years, there's been increased regulation and requirements for audit firms, and so they can only take so many audits. The last thing you want to do is finish year end and then look for an audit firm. It's too late. So do it nice and early. Consider who the audit's for. Is it just the board, specific investors, or all its shareholders? And then for tax, you need to also consider which companies do you need assistance. So before a tax tender, it may be for multiple appointments or just the one. So an example is you have a UK parent entity, you're moving into the US, you need to find a US tax support over there. And so you may be just doing a tax tender for one region. Generally, I find with tax, again, you have a small firm, small-ish firm for each region. And then once you get much larger and you need that consistency, then you'll look for a larger firm. Obviously, larger firm, more expensive. And then when you think about tax, you need to think about what specific tax needs to complete. Is it just the annual year-end taxes, or do you need the payroll tax and sales tax, or advice around import and export duties? To really be quite specific, or consider quite specifically what you need assistance with. You may find it's region specific as well. So for example, if you have a finance team within the UK, they're able to manage all your payroll taxes and your VAT returns and what have you. But then when you go to the US, you need help with sales tax, with import and export duties, particularly now after the last US election, and the annual return, as well as all of the state tax annual returns, Delaware returns, potentially your 1099s. So really need to be quite specific on what you need. And then also R&D tax returns. Is this to be included as well, or you're going to use an R&D specialist firm? So how much help do you need? Do you need full tax support, tax planning, close relationship, or just a firm to do local annual tax returns nice and cheaply? So work that out first. And then obviously you need to consider your budget. So what are you thinking about from a budget perspective? How much can you afford? It's worthwhile having a conversation with your network to work out what is industry standard, just so that you can measure the quotes against what other people, other colleagues are paying. You then need to do a tender document. So essentially you just need to draft a one-pager. It doesn't need to be long and overly complicated. And it just includes little bits about the company and what you're looking for. And then ideally, you want an introduction to the company that you want to put forward a tender. So usually I'd say at a minimum, you want to approach 3 companies so that you can compare them. I always find that the quotes are quite different. So make sure that you work out what each different company can do for you and the pros and cons for each. So working out which firms you want to send the tender document to, I usually start with the board and the shareholders. So ask them if they have any recommendations or if they have a preference. If they say that they want top tier 1 straight away, unless you're about to go to an exit, I wouldn't recommend that. So they may be a little bit biased. So you can potentially go to the one that they recommend and then compare it to another 3 that are a bit more rational. This is not uncommon. Ask your network for recommendations, or use a firm partner that you've used in a prior role that you really liked as far as their work is concerned. So I would go to those 3. Budget may be a real factor, so you may be that may narrow down the pool of possibilities. But as I said, I usually go with about 3 to 5 in that initial tender process. And then most firms, or I'd say all firms, want to have a meeting with you before providing a quote. So they will have the tender document, but they would absolutely want to do a 30 to 60-minute conversation so they understand your material issues, perhaps ask questions so that they can understand the company. They will obviously do a sales pitch to you, so you will have to sit through a PowerPoint presentation. They haven't upgraded that. That's just what you're going to have to do. So they will be promoting themselves and telling you what they can or can't do. Now, if you have a few things that you really want to make sure that they have, some features, some support, the way they work, those kind of things, jot them all down and ask. And then in these meetings, you have the opportunity to ask them if they do whatever it is that you want. So for example, if you only want to deal with a portal where you share documentation, say for the audit, for example, instead of doing back and forth emails, that could potentially be one of your questions. And generally, I find quotes will come between 1 to 5 business days later. And then once you've received all those quotes, then you can make a decision. So I don't always go for the cheapest. Sometimes the main requirements are about timing, experience, the way they work operationally. So I make a decision based on all the different factors that I consider to be important. I will then make a decision and then present my decision with reasoning to the CEO or founder with my analysis. They can either agree or disagree. And then particularly if it's audit, you'll also need board approval. So you need to do the same process with the board. Tax accountants may or may not need board approval. Generally, I find not, but audit, absolutely, because audit is working for the board. And then you can tell the good news to the firm that has won the tender, and then definitely tell the firms that you're not going to go with the bad news. Firms understand it's part of the tender process. They get rejected 2 out of 3 pitches or more. So just a short, to the point email is fine. They might come back and ask for some feedback, and then you can decide whether to respond or not. If you have clear requirements and they didn't meet a couple of those requirements, if you want to, you can give them that feedback, but that's not a requirement. I just think it's best to go back to people with bad news rather than just ignoring them. So anyway, so that's kind of the audit and tax tender process that I go through with my founders. It's, as I said, it's relatively straightforward. It does take a bit of time and a bit of resources. So really allow for that time. Don't do it last minute because it's just too stressful. So hopefully that's useful. If you are interested in understanding that leadership role within a startup or scale up, finance leadership to be quite specific, then don't forget to click subscribe because this is exactly what I talk about. And also we have a free leadership guide that you can download. So I'll leave the links below and you can check that out. Otherwise, see you next week. Cheers.